care who you think you are. That flag comes down today or we'll begin the process of seizing your home.
Have you ever wondered if the person you're trying to bully is actually the person who created the rules of the game? What happens when a small-time tyrant with a clipboard and a power complex decides to take on someone who doesn't just know the law, but spent their entire career crafting the very foundations of it? Stick around. The most surprising part happens just a little later, and you'll want to watch until the end because it gets even more unbelievable than a simple neighborhood dispute. The story takes place in the prestigious gated community of Oakwood Heights, a neighborhood where the grass is always exactly 2.5 inches tall and every mailbox is painted the same shade of pensive taupe. For most residents, Oakwood Heights was a dream, but for the Homeowners Association Board, it was a kingdom to be ruled with an iron fist. At the head of this board was Diane Sterling, no relation to our protagonist, though she certainly acted like she owned the name. Diane was the kind of person who carried a light meter to ensure no one's porch lights were too bright, and a spirit level to check the straightness of garden gnomes. She viewed the HOA bylaws not as a set of guidelines for communal living, but as a sacred text that she alone was qualified to interpret. Enter Arthur Penhaligon. Arthur was a 72-year-old widower who had moved into the neighborhood 5 years prior. To his neighbors, Arthur was just a quiet, polite man who spent most of his time in his study or tending to a small, immaculate rose garden. He drove an older, well-maintained sedan and never complained about the rising association fees. He was, by all accounts, the perfect resident. However, Arthur had a secret life that none of the suburbanites in Oakwood Heights knew about. Before retiring, Arthur hadn't just been a lawyer, he had been the Chief Counsel for the State Senate's Committee on Property and Civil Rights for nearly 30 years. If there was a comma or a semicolon in the state's property statutes, there was a high probability that Arthur was the one who put it there. Welcome to Honorbound Tales, where we celebrate the quiet giants who know how to strike back with precision and grace. Before we get into the details of this incredible showdown, please take a moment to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and comment your location below so we can know how far our stories go. Your support helps us keep bringing these tales of justice to life. Stay with us. The twist at the end is worth it. The trouble began in early October. Arthur, moved by a sense of historical pride and a personal connection to a local veterans initiative, decided to hang a flag on his porch. It wasn't a standard national flag, nor was it a campaign banner for a specific candidate. It was a historic commemorative flag representing the state's original founding militia, a symbol of heritage and civic duty. To Arthur, it was a quiet tribute. To Diane and the HOA board, it was a political display that threatened the neutral aesthetic of the street. Within 48 hours, Arthur received his first notice of non-compliance. The letter stated that political signage and flags of a non-standard nature were strictly prohibited under a new emergency resolution passed by the board. Arthur, being the gentleman he was, didn't immediately go to war. He wrote a polite letter back to the board, explaining that the flag was a historical commemorative piece and didn't fall under the category of political campaigning as defined by general civic standards. He even cited the specific section of the existing bylaws that allowed for decorative seasonal displays. He thought that would be the end of it, but Diane saw his polite response as a challenge to her authority. She didn't want a dialogue, she wanted a victory. The next part completely changes the way this story feels, as the board decided to double down instead of listening to reason. The board held an emergency meeting on a Tuesday night. They didn't just reject Arthur's explanation, they voted to broaden the ban. The new rule stated that any flag other than the current United States flag was considered political if it conveyed any message or historical affiliation. Then they slapped Arthur with a $500 daily fine until the offending material was removed. They assumed that an elderly retiree would be intimidated by the mounting costs and the threat of a lien on his property. They assumed he was just another resident who would fold under the pressure of a legal-sounding letter. Keep watching. The story takes an unexpected turn soon, because Arthur wasn't intimidated, he was amused. When the second letter arrived, accompanied by a photo of his porch taken by Diane herself, Arthur sat down at his old mahogany desk. He didn't look at the HOA bylaws this time. He looked at the state-compiled statutes, specifically the section titled the Homeowners Association Governance Act. He remembered writing that particular section back in 1998. He remembered the long nights in the state capitol, debating with lobbyists and legislators to ensure that HOAs couldn't overreach and strip citizens of their fundamental rights of expression. He knew that the board's assumption that they had absolute authority was about to unravel in a very public and very expensive way. Diane, meanwhile, was bragging at the neighborhood pool about how she was cleaning up the street. She told the other residents that Arthur was a troublemaker who didn't respect the vibe of Oakwood Heights. She even went as far as to suggest that the board might seek an injunction to have him removed if he didn't comply. She was so blinded by her own perceived power that she didn't bother to check who Arthur Penhaligon actually was. She didn't realize that the man she was calling a troublemaker was the same man whose signature was on the original legislative impact study for every property law in the state. What happens after they get the notice? You'll have to see it to believe it. Instead of taking the flag down, Arthur added a second one. This one was a simple white flag with the words State Property Code Section 42B printed in elegant black script. It was a bait, and Diane took it, hook, line, and sinker. She was livid. She called for a formal hearing, a public shaming of sorts, where Arthur would be forced to stand before the board and account for his defiance. She wanted to make an example of him. She invited the entire neighborhood to the clubhouse, intending to show everyone what happens when you cross the board. As the day of the hearing approached, Arthur was busy. He wasn't just preparing a defense, he was preparing a lesson. He reached out to a few old colleagues, now high-ranking officials in the state attorney general's office, and asked them for a clarification of intent regarding the statutes he helped write. He wasn't asking for a favor, he was asking for the official record. The board assumed it had the authority to redefine what political meant on a whim, but that assumption was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how state law interacts with private contracts. You won't believe who steps in to defend them, but that comes a bit later in our narrative. On the night of the hearing, the clubhouse was packed. Diane sat at the center of the long table, flanked by 4 other board members who looked like they were ready to pronounce a death sentence. Arthur walked in, carrying a single leather briefcase. He took his seat at the small table facing the board. He looked frail, his white hair reflecting the fluorescent lights, and Diane's smirk was visible from the back row. She began the meeting by reading a long list of Arthur's transgressions, using words like insubordination, aesthetic vandalism, and willful disregard for communal harmony. When she finally finished her tirade, she looked down at Arthur. "Mr. Penhaligon," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "do you have anything to say for yourself before we move to finalize the lien against your property, or are you ready to take down those ridiculous rags and pay the $3,000 you now owe this association?" Arthur slowly stood up. He didn't look angry. He looked like a professor about to explain a very simple concept to a very slow student. "Don't go anywhere. The next moment changes everything," Arthur whispered to his neighbor in the front row just before he opened his briefcase. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the overhead lights as Arthur Penhaligon reached into his briefcase. Diane Sterling leaned forward, her eyes narrowed, expecting a checkbook or perhaps a desperate handwritten plea for mercy. Instead, Arthur pulled out a bound volume that looked like it had seen decades of use, along with a single notarized letter bearing the gold seal of the state attorney general's office. "Don't go anywhere. The next moment changes everything," Arthur's neighbor whispered to his wife, sensing the shift in the air. Arthur didn't start by shouting, he started by asking a question. "Mrs. Sterling, when you and the board drafted the emergency resolution to ban what you call political flags, did you consult the legislative history of the Homeowners Association Governance Act, or did you simply assume the bylaws were a blank check for your personal preferences?" Diane scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "We don't need a history lesson, Mr. Penhaligon. We have the authority to maintain the aesthetic standards of this community. You signed a contract when you moved here." Arthur nodded slowly, placing his glasses on the bridge of his nose. "A contract, yes, but a contract cannot supersede the foundational rights established by the state, rights that were specifically designed to prevent boards from doing exactly what you were doing tonight. You see, what the board didn't realize was that political displays and historical commemorations like the one I've displayed are often protected under state free speech principles that I personally drafted 22 years ago. The next part completely changes the way this story feels as the crowd in the clubhouse began to murmur. Arthur explained that in Section 42B, the very section he had flagged on his porch, there is a legislative intent clause. That clause was written specifically to ensure that aesthetic standards could never be used as a pretext for the suppression of historical or civic expression. "I was the primary author of that bill," Arthur said, his voice gaining a resonance that commanded the room. "When we wrote it, we anticipated that some boards might try to overreach. We included a provision that states any HOA attempting to fine a resident for a protected display without a unanimous vote of the entire community, not just the board, is liable for 3 times the amount of the fines levied, plus legal fees. And since you've been fining me $500 a day without a community-wide vote, you haven't just been bothering an old man, you've been creating a massive financial liability for every homeowner in this room. Wait until you see how the HOA reacts when they realize Arthur isn't just defending himself, he's protecting the neighbors from the board's incompetence." The other 4 board members suddenly looked at Diane as if she had just handed them a live grenade. One of them, a man named Gary, who usually just nodded along with Diane, turned a pale shade of gray. Arthur then produced the notarized letter. "I took the liberty of contacting the current Chief of Staff for the Attorney General. He was my junior clerk 15 years ago. He was more than happy to provide a formal clarification of the statute's intent. It confirms that the flag I am flying is a recognized historical artifact of the state's founding and is specifically shielded from HOA interference." Stay with us. The twist at the end is worth it because Arthur wasn't finished. He pointed out that by recording a notice of non-compliance and threatening a lien based on an unenforceable and legally flawed resolution, the board had potentially committed slander of title. This meant the association and the board members personally, if it could be proven they acted with willful negligence, could be sued for damages. Diane was shaking now, her face a blotchy red. "You're just one man. You can't tell us how to run our neighborhood. We have a lawyer." Arthur smiled, a small, sad smile. "Your association lawyer is a 30-year-old associate who specializes in debt collection. I, however, have the man who wrote the book on property law sitting in this chair. If you'd like to call your lawyer and ask him if he wants to go up against the person who literally defined the terms he uses in court, please be my guest." Keep watching. The story takes an unexpected turn soon as the shaming meeting completely inverted. The crowd in the clubhouse who were initially come to watch a troublemaker get disciplined were now shouting questions at the board. They wanted to know why their association dues were being used to fund a personal vendetta that was now putting their own property values at risk of a massive lawsuit. What happens after they get the notice? You'll have to see it to believe it. In a desperate attempt to regain control, Diane tried to adjourn the meeting, but the deputy sheriff Arthur had invited as a neutral observer reminded her that according to the community's own rules, a meeting cannot be adjourned while a member grievance is still on the floor if a quorum of the community is present. Arthur stood up once more. "I'm not interested in your money, Diane. I don't want the 3 times damages, and I don't want to see this neighborhood divided. What I want is for this board to recognize that you are neighbors, not rulers. I want the immediate rescission of the emergency resolution, the complete wiping of all fines against my account, and a formal apology published in the monthly newsletter." He paused, letting the weight of the demand sink in. "If you refuse, my next call won't be to you. It will be to the State Licensing Board, where we will discuss whether the board members are fit to hold their positions given their blatant disregard for state statutes. You won't believe who steps in to defend them next. It was the residents themselves. One by one, people who had been bullied by Diane for wrong-colored mulch or unauthorized bird feeders stood up and joined Arthur's side. The shaming had turned into a revolution. By the end of the night, not only had the board agreed to all of Arthur's terms, but 3 of the 5 board members resigned on the spot, including Gary, who apologized to Arthur personally before he left the building. The ending will surprise you. Stay tuned to see the final fate of Diane Sterling. Without her board to back her up, Diane became a pariah in the neighborhood. She tried to maintain her standards, but no one listened to her anymore. A month later, the new, reformed board, led by the very neighbor Arthur had whispered to at the start of the hearing, uncovered that Diane had been mismanaging the beautification fund to pay for her own landscaping. She was forced to sell her house and move out of Oakwood Heights entirely. Arthur, meanwhile, kept his flag flying. He even added a small plaque at the base of his porch that briefly explained the history of the flag and the state law that protected it. He didn't do it out of spite. He did it so that the next person who moved into the neighborhood would know that their home was truly their castle. Have you ever had an HOA experience like this? Let us know in the comments. It's a powerful reminder that the people who scream the loudest about rules often understand them the least. If this story feels familiar, leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts on how you would have handled a Diane in your life. Hit like if you think Arthur handled the situation with the perfect amount of class and legal firepower. Your support helps us keep telling these stories of justice and honor. Share this story with a neighbor or friend who'd enjoy seeing a neighborhood tyrant get a much-needed reality check. You never know who might be inspired to look up their own state laws. The HOA assumed it had authority, and that assumption unraveled because one man refused to be intimidated. Before you go, make sure to check out our HOA Karen Stories playlist on the screen right now. We have more stories of homeowners standing up to bullies, employees outsmarting greedy bosses, and everyday people using the power of the law to protect their legacy. Thank you for watching Honorbound Tales. We believe that knowledge is power, especially when that knowledge is used to keep the peace. We'll see you in the next story.